Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning.
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 Nice to see you again. So here we are. The day number 2 just started for us. So thank you so much. I hope that you had a good sleep. So you have full of energy. Again, today it will be a lot of talking, a lot of thinking for us, but that's why we are here. So we can enjoy it one more time. I have to say that I'm very excited about the yesterday program. I feel that I've spent like almost like one semester at a university, or actually one kind of research trip I've done yesterday. So it's like a lot of energy was brought as well as taken. So I think that this exchange was really working nicely. So I hope that you also feel kind of full of energy, and even though a little bit tired, but that's part of it, and we will process it later. That's why we have a free Sunday to enjoy. But one more day of work and thinking. So I can see that there are many of us, so that's great. So I hope that we can start. So we are starting today with a workshop, which will be, and the moderated discussion, which will be led by ALANA LENTIN. So I'm very happy that ALANA is here with us. Good morning and good evening, actually, for you, ALANA.
Thank you.
Hello, hello. And just let me briefly introduce ALANA, and then I will give her the word. ALANA LENTIN is an associate professor of cultural and social analysis at Western Sydney University. She is a Jewish European woman who is a settler on Gadigal land in Sydney, Australia. She works on the critical theorization of race, racism, and anti-racism. Her latest book is called Why Race Still Matters. It was published by Polity in 2020, and she previously published The Crisis of Multiculturalism, Racism in a Nebular Age with Gavin Titley in 2011. She co-edits the Roman and Littlefield Challenging Migration Studies book series, the Decolonization and Social Worlds series at Bristol University Press, and co-presents the Race in Society web series on YouTube with Dr. Zuleika Zevalos. She's an editorial board member of Ethnic and Racial Studies and Identities, among other journals. Her academic and media articles, as well as videos, podcasts, and teaching materials can be found online at alanalentin.net. So we have a great pleasure that we can today learn from ALANA and share our thoughts with her. So I will give her the floor. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you to everybody for coming. So let me just begin by acknowledging that I'm on the unceded lands of the Gadigal and Wangal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, as is customary on Indigenous lands here in otherwise known Sydney, Australia. I'd like to recall that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And we tend to begin with this acknowledgement of country here in light of the fact that this is still a colonized place. These are still colonized places, and that we, even those of us who are migrants, as I am, to Gadigal country, are always still enacting the settler colonial project. So I thought it would be a good idea to do something relatively informal. And Andrea and I had a chat yesterday about how that would go. I believe you've been given a couple of texts that I've written, and I formulated a few questions for us to discuss. But I also came up with sort of something that you might find a bit more interesting to do before that, based on the book that Andrea mentioned, Why Race Still Matters. So before I go to that, I thought it would just be really nice to know a little bit about who you are. So Andrea said a few words about me. Yes, I was actually born on occupied Palestinian land. I grew up, however, in Ireland, in Dublin. I lived in many different locations in Europe. I studied in the United Kingdom, in Italy. I also lived in Hungary for a year. So I know most of you are from Central Europe. So I am quite familiar with Central and Eastern Europe, although I haven't been there for many years. And I moved to Australia in 2012, so relatively recently. So I'm still learning about race in this place, which is quite interesting and quite horrifying in many, many ways. So I believe that many of you are involved in various forms of activism. I'm somebody who came to academic work through my anti-racist activism. And that continues to be the most important reason for why I do this work. So I'd really love to know a little bit about you all so that we can have, you know, a shared space over the next hour and a half to get to know each other a little bit. So I don't know if you're open to that. Would somebody like to begin? It's always difficult to be the person who begins.
I can try to break the ice.
Oh, thank you.
No problem. Come on. So, hi, ALANA, and thank you for coming today. We're a bit, as Andrea said, we're a bit tired from yesterday, but tired in a good way, if you know what I mean. So yeah. I'm just going to try to keep it short. So I'm Boris. I'm currently teaching. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in Croatia at the University of Rijeka at the Department of Cultural Studies. And I researched for the last couple of years migration and representational practices of migrants on the illegal routes, so to speak, from Middle East and North Africa towards Schengen Europe. Before that, I did my PhD in visual activism from Harun Farokhi to Arab Spring. So it's a bit of, for now, ethnographic practice of actually being in sight with the migrants, and a bit of academic practice of actually writing research articles in relation to the rights and ethical questions regarding representation of migrants in these tough times. So super, super short.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much.
No problem.
I mean, I can go around on the screen the way I see you, if you like, if that's easier for everybody. But it seems that Pavel is next.
So good morning, everyone. Hello, ALANA. Pleasure to meet you online. I'm a PhD candidate in social anthropology, among other things, in Switzerland. And I've been working on doing ethnography of infrastructure and how it maps on unequal access to the water in Jordan, in Middle East, and the situation of vulnerable communities, primarily of Bedouin and nomadic origin. And my project is a multimedia project because I'm trained as a filmmaker as well. So the film is called Living Water. It's out, and now I'm finishing with my written part of dissertation. And I'm very much excited to discuss with you your articles. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Aga, is it Aga?
Hello, nice to meet you, ALANA. Good morning, everyone. So I'm curator with background in law, graduating from law school in Poland and in Germany. And I also completed curatorial studies. Now, currently, I'm based in Berlin. So I started my juridical practice in the question of transitive justice, and it gave me the impetus to further investigations, such in which way we do call justice, how far do the visual forms of calling justice influence our action. And I curated a couple exhibitions dedicated to law and visuality, or further the question what structure law and legal system is, how we can deal with that. And it was the exhibition Dreams, Drama, Loss as Literature in NGBK Berlin back 2017, and I did that exhibition together with the Slovak curator artist Jaro Varga. And we published afterwards the book, The Reader, under the same title. And yeah, I'm for now, my main interest is to progress with the calling justice and how do we make an articulate claim. So I deal also with the question of migration, and I've just started a program with Marina Naprushkina here in Berlin, in Nachbarschaften, to conceptualize the question how we can react on such situation as we observe now on Belarusian and Polish border, and what are the possibilities to keep not only the discussion in that vicious circle of interest and then silence, but to keep it more present, like, and ongoing. So that maybe is also a point you made in your book. We read before that lecture and that workshop. Yes, thank you. This is, yes, from my side.
Thank you so much.
Sorry
Thank you
for talking too long.
No, it's very interesting. Everybody's doing such diverse things. It's really wonderful. Great. How about Natalie?
Yes, good morning. Hello, Alana. My name is Natalie, and I come from Amsterdam, and I'm a teacher and researcher at the Amsterdam University of the Arts. And this year I started a PhD in art, activism, citizenship, and education. And I will be doing anthropological fieldwork into activist art practices to study their strategies and values, and then to translate it into an interdisciplinary module for education for students in arts and social sciences.
Wonderful.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Short and sweet.
Yeah.
How about Kuba?
Hello everyone. So I'm Kuba. I'm a graphic designer. I'm running my own practice in Berlin, and I'm also interested in visual aspects of protest. Also actively, we're actually right now making a protest in CCA Center of Contemporary Art, Ujazdowski Castle in Warsaw. Inside the institution, which has been taken over by the right-wing government, and the director, which has been appointed for 7 years without a competition. So we have a lack to. I have designed the exhibition, and my partner has a major work in a show, and we've like 2 days ago we have hanged the big banner, which is contrary to the institution's policy, on the artwork of my partner, and it has been quite a hot days recently, but they are not allowed to take it down actually.
Oh, okay.
So they needed to take the statement, and also we have managed to really make a prank. So we have kind of made a false statement by the institution, and posted it on internet wherever we could with our banner. And it actually, even important curators in Poland believed that it is an official statement of the castle, which is quite a success, because now of course they need to say no, we are not for opening the humanitarian corridor for people waiting on a Belarusian border. And yeah, so this is ongoing.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, well, thank you for that. Julia?
Hi, I'm also from Poland, like Kuba and Aga. Usually I'm Warsaw based. Now I'm at the Polish-Belarusian border, as far as it's legal to be. Like, I mean, as close to the border as it's legal to be. And like here I'm working with some Austrian journalists on the material, on what's happening here. And yeah, as I am part-time, I work as a journalist, but I'm also a PhD student and preparing my PhD on museums and on how Jewish heritage is being present present or absent there, like in the regional museums. So how local identities and local like different ethnicities and are being shaped and how they meet with the Jewish identity there and past, like Polish Jewish past of the region. So that's my PhD, and I'm also an artist, like artist/activist. I'm doing politically engaged art, and I'm a member of Collective Łaski. It's a small feminist collective from Poland and Japan right now. And well, one of us is in Kyoto, so like yeah, we're now like here and there, and we're mostly dealing with identity. Our main strategy is to deal with songs. We take mainstream lyrics and change the message into progressive and leftist one. It can like so like we deal with that nostalgia and with what we know, like what we all know, what we like the lyrics and melodies we know by heart, but we add new meaning in order to somehow play with that tension and to send a new message. So yeah, that's I think more or less me.
Highly impressive. Thank you so much. Next is Chrisia, I think. I'm not sure if you're able to share your screen. You're on your phone. Maybe not. So maybe we'll move on. Teresa?
Hi. Hello.
Oh, she's there. Oh, hello. There you are. Yes. Hello. Sorry.
No, I'm from Romania. I'm also of Romani or Gypsy background. I'm a visual artist. I'm doing small paper pieces and also sculpture installation. And I'm also doing a DBA, Doctorate of Visual Arts. My practice and my study is about exploring the races in especially in Europe against 50 people. Family trauma, because my grandparents were part of the Gypsy Holocaust. And also that somehow made them to hide the fact that they were Gypsy. So I found out about that side of my heritage really lately in life. And I understood, I don't know, many strange behaviors or practices that are happening in my family, that it was no explanation for them to do that. Anyway, and for my practice and also for my research, I'm trying to find, I don't know, to find some peace, I suppose. I'm using Rosy Daidotti, nomadic theory, as theoretical framework, and I'm looking into childhood trauma, races, and intergenerational trauma.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Teresa.
Hi, really nice to meet you. I'm Teresa from Prague. I'm mainly graphic designer, and I'm really focusing like in my concepts on design research and experimental visual expression mainly. But I'm also working on some projects with education overlaps when I'm trying to kind of educate through the creative process from, let's say, designer point of view. And lately, I'm also close to the social issues. And for example, in my master thesis I'm done recently, I research our inability to focus on something in a time when we are overwhelmed by the element of a visual impulses we have. So I really would like to expand my point of view in this direction through a more social engaged design right now.
Brilliant. Thank you. Magdalena?
Thank you. So my name is Magdalena. I have lived my whole life in Ostrava, which is a post-industrial city in Czech Republic. Here I studied sociology and cultural anthropology, and eventually I ended up at cultural studies. And in my master thesis, I'm currently writing, I am focusing on multimodal critical discourse analysis of how the Romani, which is probably the most marginalized group in my country, how they are represented in Czech and Slovak visual fiction, what patterns can be found, and why we call these practices racist in Van Dijk's new racism form.
Yes.
In these terms, I found your text on non-racism extremely powerful and inspiring. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think last we have Barbara.
Hello, good morning. So I'm illustrator and graphic designer from Czech Republic. I also teach at the university, this branch, and now I'm finishing my PhD on socially engaged illustration and comics, and I focus on strategies that young artists choose and use to initiate some social changes throughout drawing, basically.
Oh, brilliant. Well, that's a good place to start what I wanted to talk about, because I discussed yesterday with Andrea about sharing a project that I've been developing for the last 9 months or so with Petroglyph Studios, who are comic illustrators who work with, they do basically educational comics, activist comics out of Ottawa in Canada. And so we developed together a comic that's based on the second chapter of my book, which I think you guys have read. So what I thought I would do would be to give you the very first look at this comic. So nobody has seen it apart from, obviously, the illustrator, myself and my partner and one other friend. So nobody has actually, oh no, maybe 2 other friends. And so that's it. And we're going to launch it, I think, next week. It's going to be launched in New Socialist, which is, you know, an online publication, some of you might know. And so the reason we did this was particularly because I think, well, in the sort of conclusion to my book, I tried to talk about the concept of racial literacy. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this concept. So it basically was developed by critical race theorist and researcher Frances Wyndens-Twine, who's an African-American researcher who works in California. She did some research in the, I guess, the early 2000s with children of, well, Black British children who had one parent who was white. And Frances Wyndens-Twine's theorization, or her idea, was that these children often go out into the world with no knowledge of how to navigate a racist landscape, because in the effort to shield them from racism, often their white parent tried to downplay the effects of racism in the everyday. And this led to a situation whereby these children were going out and having no idea of, you know, what to expect. And so her coinage of the term racial literacy was in order to sort of tool them with the necessary, you know, knowledge of how race is enacted in the everyday. Another person who uses this concept is Lani Guinier. She's another critical race theorist. She's actually a legal scholar. And she uses the concept in a slightly different way to kind of critique the sort of, well, the same kind of critiques that the original critical race theorists came up with, which was sort of a criticism of the legal arrangements in the United States after the passage of civil rights legislation, whereby they were basically saying that racism is still enacted through the kind of the liberal status quo that was set up by the civil rights legislation. So although people had rights in law, that actually what they faced when they went out into the world was still a very racist landscape. So she talks about racial literacy as being a key tool in dismantling and deconstructing sort of prevalent racial ideas that help people, again, to navigate a racist world. So it's really important for us to talk about what we mean when we say racial literacy, because very often, particularly, I think, it was interesting to talk about this terminology over the last year. So after the murder of George Floyd, with the kind of the uptake of many people around the world justly of the Black Lives Matter protest, and the sale of many texts, many sort of anti-racism texts, and various books by Black authors and others, encouraging people to become more engaged in anti-racist activism. And many of the criticisms coming from more veteran Black radicals and others was that this was kind of a, you know, a reframing of the Black radical struggle in a kind of a liberal agenda, whereby if you teach people about the rights and wrongs of racism, so set it in a kind of a moral framework, then people will see the light, you know. And so many people interpreted, without actually reading either Wyndham's Twine or Guinea or others who've spoken about racial literacy, they understood, or they can, you know, their interpretation of racial literacy was like, you know, let's teach white people how to be better, you know. And actually racial literacy doesn't come out of that tradition at all. So racial literacy should be, if it's done properly, should be a radical project, and it should be, for myself, for the way I think about it, it should be first and foremost a collectivist and solidaristic process. So the way I think about it is the tradition of, you know, people coming again out of the Black radical tradition who've spoken about the importance of study, anti-colonial revolutionary leaders who've spoken again about the importance of theory and study as a collective endeavor in order to strengthen and, you know, undergird revolutionary praxis. Okay, so we need education, in other words, but we need also a kind of a peer-to-peer education based in people's lived experience of the actual world as it is, right? So this is what we mean by racial literacy, is a kind of a practice of solidarity. And I think what I'm hearing, and the reason why I wanted to hear from all of you about where are you coming from and what are you doing, what are you interested in, is I think we all come to this struggle from a variety of perspectives, and we bring to it our strengths. So, you know, I definitely don't have many of the skills, or any of the skills that a lot of you people have in terms of the visual arts. People here are curators, people are artists, people are, you know, working with comics, people are doing other kinds of actions of this kind. I might, you know, my skills might be elsewhere, but I can join together with other people who have diverse skills in order to sort of think collectively about how we can embed racial literacy in order to give us a sort of, the way I look at it is a kind of a toolbox that we can go to when we need ideas, when we need ways to think about where we go to next. Because obviously, as many of you are saying, the challenges that are being faced at the moment are extremely critical. And we're in a moment, I think, of very entrenched crisis. And very often what we do when we're in that kind of moment is that we want to react, and we have to react. We have no other choice but to react. But we also need to do that by reflecting back on what we've learned from the past, okay, and how we can take that forward in order to build a better future. So obviously, visual activism has become, I think, more and more important with the advent of the internet, and the fact that we can share a wide variety of material quite easily. Okay, and so that's something that possibly has always existed, but something that I think has become strengthened over recent years. Yeah. So together with Petroglyph Studios, I created this comic, and I'd love to let you have a look at it if you're interested. I don't think I don't know, has everybody had a look at the text that I sent around? Okay, so it's probably not necessary for me to narrate in depth the entire thing, because you're already familiar with the arguments in the comic or in the chapter, but I'm quite happy for you to stop me at any point as I go along. So what I've done is I've created a presentation based on the comic, so I can zoom into different parts of it. Yeah, so I'm going to share that with you now. Can you see? You're able to see.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So this is basically the first page. The first page of the comic is a double page. So you open it like this. And the idea behind it was to have these two hands in the center of the page that kind of, you know, I think visually it's really nice, because the idea is to kind of, you know, I throw my hands up in the air and say, I'm not racist, right? Which is very often this kind of reaction that you see from people in the everyday, like, I'm not racist, but like, what do you want me to do? I'm not racist, but you know, you have to understand that if we let all the migrants into Europe, then there'll be no more jobs left for anybody else, or there'll be no welfare left for anybody else, etc., etc. We've all heard these arguments, you know, being repeated ad nauseum, possibly from your friends and family, and definitely there in kind of wide mainstream society. So I like the way she started with that. let me just moving on. So basically, the argument is built up through the kind of the central column of the first 2 pages. So the main argument, as you will have seen in the chapter, is the idea that I theorize in the chapter, so not racism, is a quest to control the definition of racism. And the idea is that people who experience racism themselves are too close to it to be able to objectively define it. And I argue in the chapter, and then you'll tell me whether or not I'm convincing, is that it's a form of racist violence. So talking about not racism or denying racism is a form of racist violence because it denies people's knowledge and experience of what racism is. So it tells them that because you're too close to it, you have no objectivity, you're actually unable to know what racism is. So I take it one step further than the mere denial of racism, which I think has always been a feature of how racism functions, and say that not only is it denial of people's experience, but it's also a redefinition of racism based on a white definition of racism that sort of factors out key elements of race as a technology of power. So racism is reduced to the attitudes of bad individuals with, insufficient morality, and is subtracted or is taken away from what we understand racism to be, which is kind of an enactment of a project of racial rule. Okay, so it's systemic, it's what I call a technology of power, it's linked to processes of racial capitalism and exploitation and super exploitation. So I give a few examples. So these are examples from the book. So Donald Trump, talking about these, women of color who are Congress members in quite racist ways, and then talking about not having a racist bone in his body, which is a very, a thing. I don't know if that you have that in other languages. Do you have this concept of the racist bone? It's a very common thing, or maybe you don't, but maybe there's a different way of saying it in other other languages. But in English, people would say, I'm not racist, I don't have a racist bone in my body, which I think is so interesting, like just from a psychological perspective, like what is this racist bone, right? So I really like the fact that she drew the racist bone, or the idea of the bone, right? So because obviously it's senseless when you display it in this kind of way, yeah? So another more recent example that I didn't include in the book, which of course, when Meghan Markle and Prince Harry spoke to Oprah Winfrey, you'll probably remember about the experiences that Meghan Markle had of racism in the royal family. And of course, the royal family immediately responded by saying that they weren't racist. And of course, you have here Prince William hugging his one black friend, all over the newspapers. So I say that not racism disconnects racism from history by making it either into an aberration, so something that's this horrible, terrible thing, but is definitely not part and parcel of European liberal democracy, or a matter of individual ignorance, so insufficient education. And that's why it's really important that we are specific about what we mean by racial literacy, because for a lot of people, the criticism of the idea of racial literacy, as I think I said earlier, is that, well, if you merely educate people, then they will be less racist, right? And of course, we're arguing that liberal forms of education have definitely been insufficient when it comes to anti-racism, because if you look at, I don't know how it happens where you are, but definitely in Australia, I have a child who's in school and they'll talk about racism as a form of bullying. So the specific nature of race is completely taken out of the equation, and it just becomes a story of being mean to another child. And even in adult settings, I think this is the predominant explanation. So feel free to stop me at any time if you want me to go slowly, or if you want a question or a comment.
I have a quick question, if that's possible.
Sure.
So could you please tell a bit more, what do you mean by technology of power?
Okay, so the idea of race as a technology of rule or a technology of power, it's quite common in race critical theory to talk about race as a series of processes or projects or technologies of rule. But the main reference for this is Wendy Chun, who actually is somebody who studies among other things, race and digital technology. And she has this super chapter called Race and Stroke as Technology. And she looks at how kind of race is enacted. So she's not interested in, like most of us who work in this area, we try to delineate between race in terms of the bioracial, so the idea of a taxonomy of different races as was invented by racial scientists, etc., and race as an overarching political project that is, as Barna Hesse would put it, colonially constituted. So ultimately, the idea of race, the differentiation between groups who are considered more or less human, is about the division between what is European and what is non-European, which sometimes tracks with who is white and who is not white, but it can be a bit more hazy than that, right? So ultimately, when we think of what race does, I'm much more interested in what race does, what it enacts, what it produces, what effects it has, rather than what it is, right? Because what it is anything that you want it to be. People like Patrick Wolf and many others have spoken about race as inherently an unstable concept that constantly needs kind of packing with content, right? And that's why it shape shifts, right? So it adapts to every context in which it finds itself. Cedric Robinson, for example, talks about racial regimes that are adaptive again. So if we think about all of these things, for me, it's highly useful to think about race as a technology, a performative technology. So something that enacts something that produces effects. And the effects, the most dominant effects, is the exploitation of people and land for the enrichment of, you know, Europe and the West and white supremacy. And as I put it in the book, for the kind of production, reproduction, and maintenance of white supremacy on a local and a planetary scale. So that's kind of my definition of what race is. So yeah, that's short. I hope that makes it. I mean,
thank you.
To boil it down, I'm interested in what race does, not what race is, because what race is whatever you want it to be. And the fixation on the idea of the bioracial, so just race as biological science or pseudoscience, is a distraction, because then it allows us to say that we're post-race, because we don't believe that stuff anymore, nominally, right? I mean, many people do, but we can say, oh, no, that's all in the past. That's something to do with Hitler, you know, that's all, or apartheid, and that's all past. And that's why we have these interminable arguments about whether, you know, as the other chapter I shared with you, whether we can talk about, you know, Israel as a racial colony or a racial settler colony, because they'll be like, well,
and an
apartheid
state.
Exactly, an apartheid state, because you say, yes, but these people suffered, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, okay, fine, stripping all that aside, what is it doing, right? How is it enacting racial rule? Is it enacting racial rule by the standards of history that we can compare and contrast, or is it doing something else, right? And I think when we look quite objectively at what's happening, we can say, well, yes, objectively, this is indeed what's happening. And the fact that Jews, like my own family, suffered at the hands of fascists is a separate issue. And the problem is that we've made this part and parcel. We've connected these two things where they don't deserve to be connected, or where they shouldn't be connected to each other. I mean, emotive as that might be and difficult as it might be for many people to accept.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions? Okay, so yeah, so basically, you know, this continues on the same issue. Basically, racism generally is portrayed as a moral failure rather than a systemic problem. And it was just, I don't know if anybody saw this on social media, maybe you were sleeping when it came out, but Jordan Peterson, the so-called psychologist, professor of psychology from Canada, who's well known as having some quite retrograde ideas, let's put it that way, went on British television, I think the other night, to talk about, and he was asked a question about racism. And he said, you know, as soon as you talk about systemic or institutional racism, that's an abstraction. What we need to know is, how did it happen exactly in this circumstance? And as soon as you talk about systemic issues, then, you know, it's meaningless, right? So I think there's a lot of effort put into saying racism always has to be intended. It always has to be like, I get up in the morning and I go, okay, I'm going to be racist and this is how I'm going to do it, right? And it's all about me and my intention to be mean and horrible to this other person, right? And nobody's arguing that there are not people who are not intentional racists, but if we were only dealing with intentional racists, we probably would have gotten rid of them by now, right? Because we could deal with it in various ways. If you're a carceral person, you could deal with it in that way, or you could deal with it through community measures or whatever. But the point is that we're talking about a world system that's based on racial differentiation, and that's something that hasn't really been dealt with. And this obfuscation of racism as a problem that is moral is a problem for anti-racism, as far as I think. I mean, in terms of what I think. So, I mean, another reaction, which is very common, is that as soon as you point this out, as this is a case of an Aboriginal rapper called, his name is Adam Briggs, and he once pointed out a situation with, I think it was a football club who had a party and they put blackface. And he basically said, you know, the problem is me pointing out the racism rather than the racism itself. So that's often the reaction. As soon as you start to talk about racism, you become the problem, which is, of course, something that Sarah Ahmed has also written about. So this leads us to the second page, in which I, in fact, talk about race as a technology of power in greater detail. So I probably don't have to go into that in great detail because I've already dealt with it. But as you can see, racism is disconnected from race. And I think this is probably the tricky part, or maybe something that you have questions or maybe points of disagreement about. We often think that racist ideology produces race. And I think that's only true, again, if we stay with a sort of 18th, 19th century understanding of what race is in terms of the bioracial. So there's this notion that there were these kind of ideologically committed racists who were running around going, let's invent these racial categorizations in order to, you know, dominate people. But the actual situation is a little bit different than that, because if you look at, if we think about race as something that is done rather than something that is, right? You can think about racial practices or racial regimes of rule already being enacted for several centuries before the idea of bioracial differentiation even ever comes onto the agenda, right? And so what you have is an opposite situation where the enactment of race in colonial context is theorized as natural after the fact, right? So based on their observations of the possibilities that Europeans had to dominate indigenous people and African people under conditions of slavery, you then had the theorization of race as a biological taxonomy, not the other way around. So when somebody like the African-American author Ta-Nehisi Coates says, race is the child of racism, I think that's right. Race is the child of racism, not the father, which is a sort of a famous quote from his book from a few years ago. I'm going, hang on a second, it's not quite as simple as that, right? It's not that racists invented race with intention. It's that race became the most successful way of legitimating European domination. And based on the practices that were already in function for several centuries, you then have the taxonomization of that, or the systematization of that within the schema of bioracial differentiation. So it's much more messy, right? And much more, yeah, I mean, messy is the best word I can come up with at the moment. It's much more messy than it appears after the fact, right? So, I mean, again, this is usually a point that people have questions about or maybe points of disagreement. So I'm happy to pause.
I have a question. Can I jump in? Yeah. I really like that idea, or I also like, I'm not like now very much involved in the critical race theory, but that way of seeing race as a kind of tool and tooling the world and as a process. But I would like to ask you about the other perspective and what Cedric Robinson pointed in Black Marxism. I think it is also a resistance, yes, and is a resistance also a part of the racism as kind of concept, going on concept, and can we really talk about the racism without talking about the resistance against upon that construct, and what is your take upon that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think from my perspective, we can never talk about any form of power without talking about its about resistance to it. I mean, it's through resistance to, let's take race, because this is what we're talking about, that we actually come to better understand it. And I think that's true for any form of power. I mean, just thinking about how I came to this research myself, right? So I was doing anti-racism activism for many years. I actually did my PhD thesis on anti-racism in Europe. And my basic contention was that it's through anti-racist understandings of what race and racism are that we can conceptualize them. Because ultimately, we don't read, we might read, so-called racial science in order to understand that history better and to understand, well, its contemporary nature better as well. But if we want to try to understand the effect of race, we tend to read or talk to people who come from an anti-racist perspective. But anti-racists are not usually credited with theorizing what race is, right? So what I did in that work was to say, well, anti-racism is not any one thing. There's a whole kind of multitude of understandings of what we should do in order to challenge racism, okay? And so anti-racism is this continuum, right? It's not any one thing. At one end, you have people who will say, well, if we follow the law, in let's say European liberal democracy, then ultimately we should have no racism, right? Because the law says that it's wrong, right? That racism is wrong. And on the other end, the far end of the spectrum, you'll have those who say, well, obviously the state itself is systemically racist. And so therefore we have to be against the nation state, and we have to be anti-colonialist in our kind of approach to dismantling race. And so therefore, those two poles will have completely different theorizations of what race is, right? So for many people at the first end, race is ultimately, or racism is ultimately, as I said before, sort of a moral problem of individual bad attitudes or insufficient education. Whereas at the far other end of the pole, you'll have people saying, well, no, what really needs to happen is a dismantling of the entire system because it's founded on, racial domination and exploitation. So obviously, I think that in order to understand race and how it is enacted, we need to come from the perspective of resistance. Like, that is where we are going to understand how race is formulated and reformulated constantly, because as I say, it's something that is in constant movement. It's something that's constantly adapting to the circumstances of the day. So the types of forms of racism that we see, of course, are continuous with the past, but they're also specific to the challenges that are coming up today. Okay, so they borrow from the past, but they also reformulate based on, what is going on today. And so therefore anti-racism is constantly playing this game of kind of catching up to the shape-shifting of race, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Sort of. Okay. So I'll just probably go on to the next page because I don't think we have that much time left. Whoops, there we go. So in the, again, this will be familiar to you, in the second chapter, I'm just looking at the time. In the second chapter that you had a read of, I tried to explain why I think it's important to actually interrogate the history of racism as a concept itself, and why I feel it's really important to think about the association or the relationship between race and racism and not sort of collapse the two together, although it can be quite difficult not to in sort of activist speech, because we need a word, like we need to talk about being against something, and we all understand what we mean when we say that we're against racism. But actually, if we look at the history of racism as a concept, it's first developed by people who were self-proclaimed racists. So people who believed that there were, that there are kind of, genetic distinctions between people of different provenances in the world. And it's then taken up by people who thought of themselves at the other end of the spectrum. So they thought of themselves as anti-racist. And I found this history that I sort of read by French historian Carole Renaud-Paligot about a particular example of this, who were these French anthropologists who considered themselves anti-racist. Some of them were involved in a journal, Racialized, that they started in the 1920s. And they were people who were basically themselves working in physical anthropology and were carrying out so-called racial experimentation. But they started to believe that there was no basis for distinguishing between different groups of so-called European races. And they argued that any distinction between, say, Nordic people and Slavic people and, you know, Southern European people and Jews was, you know, was incorrect, right? And that these distinctions should be dissolved. But the really fascinating part about what she uncovered was that these same people were very often themselves continuing their racial experimentation in the colonies, right? In the French colonies. So they didn't have kind of it was very ironic, right? That they basically, their anti-racist project was very focused on the intra-European situation. So they basically saw racism, intra-European racism, as a German ideology that was being imposed on the whole of Europe. But they completely didn't see that, you know, what was happening, that their own work in colonial contexts was part and parcel of this entire project. So the basis for this is thinking that, well, what then does racism mean, right? Can racism ever really encapsulate its full extent, or indeed where predominantly racial rule occurs in context of colonial domination and slavery and so on, and in this distinction between Europeanness and non-Europeanness, in this effort of Europe to dominate the entire globe? No, racism is theorized as a much more narrow idea, something about the distinction between groups of people living within the European continent. And if you indeed go to Black Marxism, read Cedric Robinson, he'll go back a lot further and talk about the beginnings of Christendom, which establishes itself in opposition to the Ottoman Empire and starts to consolidate itself as this kind of mythological European entity, as opposed to the Muslim world and the world beyond, right? So already you have this constellation of this idea of Europeanness that evolves over the centuries and evolves through distinguishing itself from non-Europe, from everywhere else in the globe. So racism in its original kind of theorization can never really encapsulate the problems being faced by the majority of people who are under systems of racial domination and being super exploited by, you know, systems of racial capitalism, etc. So you might argue that this is semantics, right? That it doesn't really matter what words we use. And as I said earlier, like, we all understand what we're talking about when we talk about racism. But actually, I do think it is a kind of a problem, because I don't think that we all understand what we're talking about when we talk about racism. And that's why we still have these liberal responses that focus on the morality of individuals and getting people a better education and stopping ignorance and, you know, weeding out the bad apples, as it were, right? And I think we do have to look at the original definition of racism in order to try to parse out why we have these problems even within anti-racism. So that's my basic argument there. And I've been very inspired by Barnard Hesse, who has also written a lot about, as he puts it, the kind of the Eurocentric definition of racism at its core, at its origins. And he looks quite a lot at the 1930s. So he does a little, you know, looks at a slightly different history to Renaud-Paligot, but basically they're arriving at the same kind of conclusion. Any questions about that, or thoughts, comments? I'd be very interested to hear whether or not you think it makes sense.
Can I have a quick comment? Sorry for occupying space.
That's okay. I don't mind.
No, I just find amazing that visualization, that page with the squares, as it relates really perfectly to the yesterday evening lecture of Nikon Mirtsov, when spoke about the surveillance from above and the perspective and squaring the land. as kind of tooling as well to organize the space, but also the bodies. So having that backdrop here on that page, it really automatically generates some ideas, further ideas. So what is, when we are talking about the visual means and visual forms, today, it's excellent.
That's good.
Bridge, yes.
Yeah, well, that's really good to know. Because I didn't, obviously, I wasn't at his lecture because probably I was sleeping. But yeah, that's really good to know, because obviously this is the first time that a public has seen this. So it'll be good also for me to communicate to Nicole, to the artist, because this is her idea. I gave the text, and obviously we had a conversation, but she basically came up with a design for all of the different pages. Yeah, she's very talented. So yeah, so quickly, I know we're sort of running out of time, but so I'm trying to find my cursor. Yeah.
And Alana, can I ask also one question? Actually,
sure.
it's more like general question, but why did you decide to make it as a comics? What was your?
Well, actually, I don't know if you know a scholar called Max Haven. He's also Canadian. He does some really interesting work, and he has a book now that I can't remember the name of, which is really bad. It'll come back to me. But he made a comic based on a chapter of his book about the sort of war on drugs and the opioid crisis in North America. And he also prepared it with this group, this Petroglyph Studios. And I just was really impressed by it. And I was lucky. I mean, this is just all these things that happen, but I was lucky to win a small award last year from my university. And I decided to use the money. It's like a little bit of money that came with the awards to ask them, would they be happy to make a comic? Now, actually, as those of you who work in visual arts will know, it's very expensive to produce a comic because obviously the labor is enormous, right? So I could only produce 7 pages. So I'm nearly finished. And it's a shame because I would love to be able to produce the whole book as a comic, because I think it's quite, I don't know what you think, but I think it's quite successful as a way of communicating the ideas of the book. But I don't have the funds to do the rest of it, unfortunately. Yeah, maybe one day if I manage to raise, because that's the nature of publishing, is that you can't actually, an academic press will not fund the labor that goes into this. Yeah, so it's about $500 a page. So yeah, it's quite, I mean, obviously the work is fabulous, but yeah.
So the main reason was to reach another audience, right? Or wider
Exactly.
audience?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's the idea, is that I think I really like using media of various kinds. I said to you before, I don't have the skills myself. So you'll probably be appalled to learn that I use Canva quite a lot, which is probably everybody's puking. But I mean, I can use it. It's easy for me. And I just find it great with my students and with audiences to be able to create infographics and like short posters and little posts that you can communicate easily, ideas that are quite complex. And obviously you can accompany it with longer texts, lesson plans. You know, obviously I do a lot of teaching, and teaching is the main focus of what I do. So I'm thinking constantly about how I can communicate very difficult concepts to people who may not have very often even the time to engage with longer texts, because a lot of my students are people who are first in their family to attend university. They often have to work full time. Like, you know, we were teaching on Zoom last semester, and I'd be having students who were at their jobs and tuning into the class at the same time because they just didn't have an opportunity to stop working. Yeah. So, I mean, I had a student who was working at a childcare center, another student who was at a supermarket, I think, like, you know, really this kind of stuff, because it was the people who had to do essential work who obviously still had to work throughout the pandemic and had to actually work more throughout the pandemic because of the nature of things. And so therefore you're thinking constantly, well, how can I develop, you know, visual tools that can help people to, you know, make sense of what you're trying to get over, which I think, you know, these ideas are complex. And as I said before, they're ever changing and ever adapting. And they're very difficult sometimes to grasp. So I feel like the kind of work that you all are doing is so important in order to be able to communicate these complex ideas in digestible forms. But hopefully it's not simplistic either, because I think that would be undermining people's intelligence, you know. Yeah, thanks for that. So yeah, so this is the where I get to in the chapter around the you know, the contemporary context. And there's been quite a few updates, I think, recently, especially with the attacks on critical race theory that I presume you're aware of, and they probably have their own. I mean, for example, if we think about Orban's attack on gender studies in Hungary, I mean, there's a lot of kind of overlap with the same, even the same actors who are fixating on critical race theory, be it in the United States, the UK, here in Australia, and also in France with a kind of attack on what they call indigenous thinking, right? So decolonial thought, etc., and the attempts of the Minister for Education and Higher Education to sort of investigate lecturers and teachers who are teaching this content. So we're kind of at a moment where there's a huge amount of scrutiny on the teaching of race critical and gender, you know, gender studies and trans and queer studies, etc. And I think the way I look at this, and I'm hoping to do a new book on this topic, is that ultimately this is about the power of the anti-racist or the anti-colonial movement, because this is a counterattack, right? So it's not really about, well, you know, what are you teaching? Like, nobody's really interested in what's being taught to students. This is a classic moral panic where the folk devil of critical race theory is being raised in order to counterattack against the successful anti-racism movement, like Black Lives Matter, Indigenous sovereignty, and, you know, other folk who are, you know, as in the kind of work some of you are doing on the border, etc., which is so, you know, strikes at the heart of the idea of the sovereign European nation, etc., right? So, but it's interesting that some of the characters who I scrutinized in the second chapter that you read are the same actors who are involved in the current attacks on critical race theory. So particularly Eric Kaufman, who I spent quite a lot of time dealing with, who wrote this report, Racial Self-Interest is Not Racism, has become very involved in the attack on critical race theory in the UK and elsewhere due to his global platform. So this page basically explains you know, their role. And then, sorry, I'll just zoom out. And of course, I bring this back to the discussion of what these people think racism is. So, you know, David Goodhart in particular, who's an accolade of Eric Kaufman, who also recently wrote a report about, as they see it, the kind of, you know, well, the way they put it was about freedom, academic freedom. So the idea that teaching about racism or the history of slavery or the history of colonialism in this case, British schools, was an attack on academic freedom. And so you can see the kind of link to this other stuff that was happening a few years ago. So in relation to the Racial Self-Interest is Not Racism report, Goodhart said that the problem was that what he called the normal definition of racism was being superseded by what he called mission creep. So this idea that racism now is everywhere and everybody's a racist and you're not allowed to speak your mind and you're not allowed to say what you want to say, etc., which is a key theme of the right, you know, that we're not allowed to speak anymore. And they're so much not allowed to speak that they're platformed on every single, you know, panel show on television, every single major newspaper. They're so silent that, you know, they're absolutely everywhere. So we know these kind of paradoxes. But obviously, by minimizing racism in this way and saying, again, back to this idea that racism is always about intentionality, and he adds, it's always about, as he puts it, an irrational hatred, fear, or contempt for another group, leaves out of the picture the fact that race is very often extremely rational because it has a profit-seeking motive, as you could see in the case of slavery, but also today I gave the example here of Aboriginal deaths in custody, but also of the encroachment on Indigenous lands by mining companies and so on, you know, with obviously the imprimatur of the settler state, and of course the use of asylum seekers, you know, be it at the Belarus border or be it those trying to come to Australian shores as a kind of a key pawn of the state in kind of, you know, locking down its border regime, etc., etc. So finally, I do, let me zoom around a little bit and go back to the last page, where I do bring it to resistance and note precisely that, as I said earlier, that all of these attacks on anti-racism, all of these attacks on, you know, racial literacy, etc., are an attack on anti-racism, and they're a testament to the success, of the relative success of these various you know, revolutionary struggles. So here, obviously, there are the examples of Black Lives Matter movement, the campaign of the invisible undocumented farm workers in Italy, protesters in Palestine, the blockade in Canada, and so on and so forth. And in fact, just last week, I saw an extremely inspiring video that some of you may have seen of Indigenous people in Canada who had basically successfully, you know, locked their land off from mining companies who were supposed to be starting digging in their territory, and they successfully basically requisitioned and destroyed their vehicles and have managed for the moment to kind of, you know, seal themselves off from this encroachment on their land. So yeah, so that's the comic. I'm not sure if we're going to have any time to go to the questions, Andrea, but I'm happy to remain with this and possibly to take more questions and comments from people.
Yeah, actually, I think that we don't have to go through the slide with the set questions. I think that we've done partly a discussion during your presentation. So I think that we can just jump into the discussion and just to follow our thoughts and providing you with some reactions and response.
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, so we can just leave it open. We have still like 20 minutes to go, which is good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Discussed. So yeah, just move to the discussion part at this moment. And thank you for showing us the comic. I suppose that it might be successful. I hope so. That the general public can enjoy it, and we are actually the first audience. So that's a special thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm more than happy to take any questions, comments, critical views, whatever you feel.
Julia has a comment, so I will ask Julia to join.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that project. It's really interesting and inspiring, but my question is very, very basic, I'd say. What's the audience for that project? How do you imagine people, like you mentioned your students, but who else would profit from that comic?
Yeah, I don't have any fixed answer to that really, because I'm wondering whether or not you have to have a lot of explanation or to have read the chapter in order to be able to understand everything that's there. So that's an open question for me. I mean, the way I'm hoping to present it is with a kind of a preliminary text, like a short one page that kind of sets it in context and, you know, with like hyperlinks to further reading, etc. So I don't see it necessarily as something for people who've never engaged in this material to be able to engage with, right? That was something that somebody said to me, oh, do you feel that the language is a little bit too complex, etc.? And I was like, well, I don't think the kind of work that I do is very entry level. Like this work, I have done other stuff, like I've used TikTok, for example. I've done a few videos there, which just tries to boil down and very basically, like, for example, why is the concept of white privilege a problem, right? Like, why do I think it's not a good concept? And in 3 minutes. So I can do that stuff as well. And I think there, you know, that can be a really good tool. But this is slightly different. This is for people, I think, who are already engaged with thinking a little bit more deeply about these questions. People who, like yourselves, who are involved in anti-racism activism, who've probably read some texts, etc., and want to think a little bit further about some kind of received ideas about race, so that maybe they can take the conversation further with their own activist community or their students, or, you know, whoever it is that they're in conversation with. So probably it would be, it's not it doesn't stand completely alone, right? And part of the problem is, as I said, a material problem in the sense that I don't have the funds to create the whole thing. And so obviously if you had more of a longer thing, then it would be more explanatory in and of itself. But I definitely welcome people to take it and use it as they like to. So, if you wanted to use, like, for example, this version that I've created as a presentation, if you wanted to use it in your activist group and give a talk or help people to, or point them to further readings, etc., then it's like Creative Commons, like, usage, etc.
Well, that's actually great. I think I would do that definitely.
Great, super.
Yeah, I will try to translate it to like Eastern Central European context maybe, but yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
definitely. You can translate it to your own context. Absolutely. Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Alana, I have one question and one kind of a short comment.
Yeah.
When you were talking actually about these infrastructures of power, which actually do operate and they actually make the racism an ongoing process, which is more like, let's say, a platform which can be filled with the content based on the context in which we are operating, which is what Julia is now talking about, actually translating into her context.
Yeah.
So obviously it's an example of this. So I was thinking actually about and that's the comment part. I was thinking about this term that I just recently encountered in some migration and refugee studies. It's moral technologies. So that these are not like only power technologies, but they are moral technologies, because immediately they operate with the perspective of hierarchy. And this is something which actually Nick Mirza's yesterday's talk was about any kind of regular visualization tools, even though they are mental, even they are practical and pragmatical, for example, in visual arts, which create this hierarchy and which put the objects and subjects under the surveillance and under the control. So that's why I'm more thinking about these moral technologies than power technologies, because they immediately trigger these connotations of the social aspect. And the racism is a social process, as you are making this distinction of race and racism. So that's what I just wanted to comment, like something that I
think there's a really interesting, so if you look at the work of Eduardo Benil Silva, he uses this notion of the racialized social system, and in which there are different registers, including, the social, the psychological, I can't remember all of them, but there are various registers at which this operates, right? In order to kind of, I think there's also an emotional register, etc. And I think that's really useful because it helps us to see how race, plays out in all of these different contexts. So what I tried, and there's a book by Ali Megji called The Racialized Social System, I think that's the title, which is coming out in the new year, which I think does a really good job of kind of, explaining that and kind of crystallizing a lot of Benil Silva and other critical race theorists' thought in order to sort of bring it all together. So it's super useful. I think in my work, what I try to do is maybe boil it down to, well, what is the purpose of race, right? So rather than looking in great detail and sort of distinguishing more, let's say, sociologically between its different registers, which would be necessary to do and is being done, as I said, by other people, in my work, I try to think about, well, what is its overarching, what is it needed for? What is its purpose? And ultimately its purpose is, in order to enact exploitation and domination. And obviously it then occurs, it has its social manifestations, its emotional, psychological manifestations alongside its political ones. But yeah, thank you for that. I hadn't actually heard that terminology before, so I'm going to look that up. Thanks.
And my very short question would be, how do you perceive the issue of the violence and the representation of the physical violence? Because because it's so performative, it's so visible, it's so affective, all these visual representations of the physical violence. So when we talk about the racism in the media, in our general talk, in our households and at schools, so immediately it turns this individual perspective again, because when when I do interact with someone physically, it's peer-to-peer. It makes it this liberal perspective immediately. It enables us to think through this perspective of individual racism, that it's actually a willing action, it's something intentional, which is something that you criticize here. So how to deal with this overrepresentation of the physical violence as a part of racism?
Well, I think, you know, well, Nick has done good work on this. And in fact, there's a paper that I've written which builds on Nick's work in The Appearance of Black Lives Matter, in order to discuss, actually, I could have shared this with you because it's probably the only paper that I've written that actually deals with like visual stuff, but I can share it with you just for interest later on. But the reason I was really interested in this, well, I was doing actually a project on anti-racism apps. So apps that you can download for your phone that have a kind of an anti-racist intention. And some of them are literally for reporting on incidents of racism. So you take my phone out and I can take a video or picture of something that's happening, and then I can upload it to, you know, this organization who's going to, you know, whatever, take a legal case or whatever it might be. And some of the other apps have a more kind of pedagogical intent. And one of them, which I analyzed in this particular paper, I'm trying to remember the title of the paper now. Sorry, it's really late. It's a paper that I wrote myself and I can't remember the title, but anyway, it doesn't matter. The app that I analyzed is called the Everyday Racism app. And it was created by an anti-racism charity here in Australia. And basically the way it works is that you sign up for the app and you can play one of four figures, right? So you can either play a Muslim woman who wears a hijab. You can play, so these are avatars, right? They're like cartoon characters, right? So there's the Muslim woman, there's the brown man who's supposed to be an Indian student called Vishal, I think his name is. And then there's an Aboriginal man, so kind of a dark-skinned man. And then there's yourself, right? And yourself is this empty, genderless, faceless, gray avatar, like contentless, right? And so I use Nick's work and other people's work. So Derek Hook, who's a kind of psychoanalyst who does a lot of work with Frantz Fanon, in order to think about, well, what is this yourself doing, right? So yourself is supposed to absorb the information about these other racialized characters and decide on how they are going to respond to racist incidents and experiences that these other characters have. So you basically sign up for the app, and over a week, it sends you messages and prompts like, you know, this happened, how do you react? Like a kind of a choose your own journey kind of story, right? So that you can think about, you know, building empathy. The whole idea is that you build empathy and you think about, you know, putting yourself in these shoes. But obviously the critique is that yourself, by being, you know, neutered of race in itself, doesn't actually have to put themselves in the context of the white settler colony, right? So it's like those spaces of non-appearance that Nick Mirzov talks about, right? And so as a way of thinking about racism, it's really problematic because the racialized avatars don't get a say in how to respond to their racism. It's only yourself, which obviously is the white, you know, the embodiment of whiteness, who gets to take a decision about how to respond, whatever that may be, but at the same time is not put into the story of race, is not made part of the story, is outside of the story. So whiteness is disappeared, right, in this landscape of racism that's sort of presented to us as a kind of a smorgasbord of kind of possibilities that you then get to consume. And it's very similar with the kind of the representations of racist violence that we constantly see on our screens. And that's why many Black writers have talked about the kind of the videos of murders of Black people by police, etc., as a form of modern day digital lynching, right? Lynching postcards, sorry. So they're almost like the lynching postcard that we're then supposed to consume. And of course, the idea is that it's only if we see this violence that we will understand what to do, okay? And the criticism is quite basic and obvious. It's like, we know this is happening, right? We understand this is happening, particularly those of us who benefit from racialized power, right? Because those systems are, you know, we benefit from the arrangements as they are, right? And so we don't need to see the full extent of this violence. But what we need to do is to admit to ourselves that it's happening. It's not about revealing some kind of hidden truth that, you know, suddenly now everything's going to fall into place and we're going to understand it. It's the work is a different one. And almost what happens, the more we see this, the more we are in denial about, or the more we are sort of inured to its effects. So, you know, it was interesting the other day, I read something in relation to Palestine where somebody was saying, you know, no matter how much visual evidence there is of the enactment of colonialism in the everyday in Palestine, you'll still get people saying, you know, you'll still get Zionists saying, well, come and see for yourself, you know, come and see for yourself. And then the truth will be revealed to you, as if like these stories are telling something else that isn't really true, right? So the point is, you can always interpret what you're seeing in the way that you want to see it. You can always tell yourself, well, you know, George Floyd shouldn't have used a counterfeit $20 note, because if he hadn't used that note, then he would never have found himself under the knee of that guy, what's his name, the person who, Darren Wilson, the cop who murdered him, right? So you can always, right? So the point is, do we need to see this violence, or does it just become this kind of performance of horror that then has this re-traumatizing effect constantly on Black and Indigenous, etc. people? But yeah, I mean, it's a question as well. You might have some thoughts on, I don't know.
No, I have a thought that this is an important question, but actually it's not a question of us, because this is a matter of citizen journalism. Like people need to share when they see it. And maybe this is the more important need than if we need to see it, because they really need to spread the message when they witness something like that.
I agree with you, and it's creates a very, you know, it creates new avenues for criminalization, because we know that the person who filmed the murder of Philando Castile, I think, I'm going to get this wrong, but one of the people who was murdered in the last sort of 7-8 years by the cops in America went to jail. He went to jail for filming the incident, right? So I'm not saying that people don't have a need to share it, and that even that these actions haven't had a benefit. I mean, they have, but we also have to be, we just have to be aware of what effects they produce. And one of the effects that they produce is this kind of, this inuring, this kind of, you know, neutralization of the horror of death, right? And I just think that it's a double-edged sword. I'm not saying that, and the solution is never share a video of somebody dying, right? But when you think of the constant replaying of George Floyd's murder, like how many times have you seen, and I did not go and watch that video. I never watched it. But then you put the television on for something or other and it's playing, and they're talking about something, Black Lives Matter, and then this poor man being murdered again. And it's just playing in the background, like there's the newscaster is in the foreground, so it's really about them, and that's just playing in the background. So you're not even being called to really look. It's just background noise at this stage. So yes, maybe it needed to be seen and it did spur us all into action, but how many times does it need to be replayed? Like, it's a question that I think, I don't have the answer to, but it does raise some very important ethical questions, I think.
So obviously this is triggering a lot of reactions. We have 3 of them. So I would actually...
Okay, I know we need to finish.
Yeah, if we can actually dedicate 10 more minutes. Are you okay?
Oh yeah,
ALANA?
if you want to.
If we can
if you have
this?
the time, yeah.
Yeah, I have actually many comments regarding kind of like a collective visual memory, etc., etc., but I will leave the space for our participants. So the first one was Pavel, then Agnieszka, and then Boris.
Yeah.
So Pavel, please go ahead. Thank you.
Well, I have a lot here as well, but let's pick one. I think the most important, in terms of my own practice, and we're discussing a lot the idea of undoing. How to position ourselves. To kind of okay, there's awareness, but how does it really seep into how we collaborate with people, what we produce together, or you know, what's the authorship of that, how we work with institutions in different places, with all of this colonial history and still kind of unfolding or shape-shifting, or colonial relations or power relations shape-shifting. And you know, I work in Jordan. I was trying to kind of forge relationships with the government as well. And there is the US in the back. There is a Swiss embassy sitting right next to me, stuff like that. But how do I, you know, I'm thinking about my own whiteness. You know, drawing on the Frantz Fanon's famous book, you know, when he realizes he's being stared at, and and then he analyzes that, what it is to be stared at by someone who is afraid of him. Okay, if I invert it, yeah, maybe I don't know how to put it as a question, but how to enact a decolonial project being a white cis male living in a Czech Republic, which enriched itself from the, I don't know, the use of coal, and actually, you know, flooding the rest of the planet somewhat through the machine called climate change, and then going around the world and talking about, you know, let's fix that and stuff like that. And, you know, what can I do as an individual, knowing all that, and yeah, idea of responsibility and whiteness. I guess that's the question somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a perennial question. I think it's a question that needs to be continually asked. But I think if the answer is don't do anything, then I think it becomes a problem. I'm getting, you know, I don't know how to put this. It's a very, very complex problem, because I think there's a limit to how much interrogation of one's own whiteness is actually serving anything, right? And there's a brilliant essay written by an Indigenous writer who's also a legal scholar. Her name is Alison Whitaker. You can Google it. It's called So White, So What, right? And it's absolutely brilliant, right? Because she's like, it's a sort of a narrative. It's not an academic essay, although she basically criticizes or critiques Robin DiAngelo's white fragility. But beyond that, she tells all kinds of stories that you might find personally interesting. So she talks about how it became a thing for various white people to talk to her about how uncomfortable they were with being white, right? And she's like, well, that's the link. She goes, what do you want me to do about it, right? Like, why do I need to absorb this? Like, I'm an Indigenous person, you're settled on my land, right? And you want me to somehow make you feel better about the fact that you feel bad about being white. Okay, I'm not saying this is what you're doing, right? And I think many of us here benefit from whiteness, right? So we're sort of talking among white people, maybe different gradations of white, you know, depending on where you are, and you know, whiteness can look in various different ways depending on where you find yourself, etc. So there's no monolith of whiteness, etc., and all the rest of it. But at the same time, I think that basic question of us constantly interrogating our whiteness becomes disabling, but also becomes taxing upon Indigenous and other racialized people. Like, it becomes extremely taxing. That not only do they need to deal with racism, they then need to deal with our existential problems, you know. And they're like, seriously, like, dude, go and see a psych, or like, go and like lie on the couch for a while, because I don't have the time to. I mean, you know, I'm being funny, but that's kind of the tone of her article, and it's so brilliant because she's such a brilliant writer. She's also a poet. And it just makes you think very differently. So rather than me, I mean, you know, I just think read it, because I think it'll help you a lot to think. And then I think, because I know her, I think what she would say is, well, we need you to stand with us. We don't need you to be those who lead, right? But we need you to be there. We don't want you to think, well, I'm so sorry, I'm so paralyzed by my feelings of, you know, feeling bad about being white, that you then sit down in your room and never do anything, right? Because that's the problem. And there are people who will tell you, don't do anything. We don't want to hear from you anymore. You're only making problems. And I think that's very, I think we need as many bodies as possible to be working together. you know, and I think it's how one does it. And that's up to each individual to come to terms with how one does it through solidarity or through collective action with those who are most affected. That's the key. And there are many difficult conversations that will be had and many mistakes that we will constantly make. And that's okay, because it's not actually about us. Do you know what I mean? I think that's the thing. You let yourself off your hook and say, well, it's not actually about me. Then it becomes much easier to be in solidarity.
Thank you, Alana, for pointing out our focus on the text, and Pavel for sharing the link.
Yeah, thanks.
And so at this moment, there are 2 more questions or comments.
Sure.
First
Sorry, I'll try and be briefer in my response.
Comes from Agnieszka, and the last one will come from Boris.
Yeah.
I will try to be very quick, and I really liked Pavel's question, but I would like to come back to the conversation and Andrea's question on violence representation, and then your Alana response on the reporting, recording, and images. And it relates to evidence and evidencing as a process. And as a lawyer, a legal scholar, I deal also with, and it's a part of my interest. So my question is like, going in that direction, you said something like to really look at, and to really look at those images, to really look at this picture. And then it popped up in my mind, in my head, a question is, what does it mean to really look at according to the evidence and evidencing? Because when those images are really produced, because we have those circulating as George Floyd murder evidence, like that recording, yes, but was it then the same recording circulating in the media and then as evidence, and then again described in the judgment, and then reported on some opinion, and fragmentized, analyzed by some certain people coming from certain background, and going through those process, I just feel that we have a certain images on certain different status, and yeah, how do you feel about it? Is it like this? What happens to these images, and when they are really produced, or when they happen then?
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, I had a project that I wanted to do, which I haven't actually been able to raise the funds to research, but I'm really interested in this whole notion of evidence, not so much from the legal perspective, but from this idea of the production of evidence, and who owns, or okay, ownership is a difficult word, which has its own ramifications, but who is responsible? Who is responsible for the sharing of this evidence? Okay, and if you think about it, there is what I try to theorize as a political economy of testimony, which I think has grown in the age of social media. So you will find many people whose careers are dedicated to, or partially dedicated to, the dissemination or the curation and dissemination of this evidence. And so there's a whole industry, I'm thinking here in Australia, of people who have made documentary films and written books and even feature films about be it genocide, so genocide of Indigenous people, or this situation I was thinking about when I was writing the project of people who were, detained in asylum seeker detention centers. And there's been this whole sort of industry of people. So, for example, there's one person in particular who was a former worker in a offshore detention center, who's written 2 books, not one, but 2 books based on his experiences of being a sort of a social worker, educator in these camps. And I think, he's a good campaigner. I don't think that there's anything I think he's fine, like as a person, as a human being. I don't know him personally, but he seems like a good guy. But he's a kind of a guy who just didn't, at the age of something like 21, he went off and not really knowing what to do with his life. He went off and basically went to Manus Island or Nauru, I'm not sure, I think it was Nauru, to work with, obviously Nauru, because there were children there, to work with children in this camp, right? And then, of course, he became horrified by the whole experience, and he then managed to write these 2 books, etc. But you think like, okay, great. So, now you're quite a notorious fellow. You've made a little bit of money. I'm not saying it was cynical. I don't think his motivations were cynical. But we do need to interrogate what the function of his 2 books were, considering that that camp still exists and that children in those camps are suiciding, have been sexually abused, have been, some of them have become critically ill because they basically starved themselves because they're so emotionally destroyed by their experience that they don't eat. Young children. I mean, we're all familiar with these stories. So we do have to ask ourselves, well, what are these books for? And so I am worried about the curation and dissemination of evidence. Like, in whose hands is this evidence, and why do we listen to particular voices, not other voices? And then the elevation of some voices over others. So much as I admire him, the Kurdish journalist Behrouz Bouchani, who was detained on Manus Island for 8 years, nevertheless has been made this kind of cause célèbre. I don't think he wants it himself, but because he's an extremely talented writer and he managed to make a film while in detention with, a Dutch Iranian filmmaker, he smuggled snippets of video out to, and this person made a film and it went to international film festivals, etc. Then he wrote this book that I think has been translated into 30 languages. And eventually he's managed to escape to New Zealand, and thank God he has a new life there. But it's almost like this guy, and so many of the letters of support for him. So when he went to New Zealand, he went on a temporary visa and he didn't have refugee status. And then so many letters were written in his support, and everything was about how exceptional he was as an artist, right? And he himself kept making the point, it shouldn't matter that I'm a good writer, right? There are men there who were detained with me who maybe they're illiterate, I don't know, or it doesn't matter what they were, or what skill they have. The point is that they did not deserve, or they do not deserve, to be in the position that they're in, right? But the only mechanism through which his supporters could understand his predicament was through his exceptional ability, and somebody who had to be saved because his art was such a gift to us, right? So it became about us and our consumption. And I think that's, so I do think there's a huge amount of work to be done on this topic, but, the kind of research that I do, this would necessitate, having a good few years to really, it's a very complex topic. Unfortunately, the kind of research that I do is not supported with research funds. So everything that I do has to be done sort of on top of my ordinary teaching work, et cetera, because you can imagine that the border regime in Australia is not very favorable to this kind of research. But I'd be fascinated if somebody else was doing this kind of work to discuss with them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ALANA. I think that we've, again, like from the conversation, we've at this moment got a lot inputs again. And the last question comes from Boris, and then we will close the session.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think I'm going to recede from asking the question because it was in part answered, and in part, we're running out of time. I just like it while I'm still unmuted, just say thank you for the wonderful lecture. And I just have a couple of things, for the last 20 or 30 years that was being wrote about, even from Susan Sontag, from her regarding the pain of others, exactly. the things you're talking about, the paradox of living in a culture that has a hyperinflation of images, but at the same time, the hyperinflation of indifference towards images. So it's a certain paradox. And what you're opening now, at the end is really important with a different, evidence-based image productions like forensic architecture, which also has like ethical problems regarding, and I use them sometimes for my teaching, but also it's, the question is, who is it for and what does it do? So there are important questions, but, we're out of time. So I hope we can discuss them at some certain other point.
Well, I'd be fascinated to read because I've always had a slight discomfort with that whole project. So I'd be really happy to read anything that anybody's writing or thinking about. Yeah.
Thank you.
It just kind of sits like, you know, it doesn't sit well with me, and I'm sometimes not really sure exactly why. So I need to do a lot more thinking, but I have my ideas, but I need the time and space to think much more deeply about why my gut tells me what it's telling me, you know.
So I would like to thank ALANA for being here with us for more than an hour and a half. We greatly appreciate it. I'm very happy that we had a chance to read your text in advance, because I think that it kind of enhanced a lot our discussion, and it was a great advantage for discussing more and deeper. I think that the questions that you prepared for the discussion, I think that they were still kind of involved in what we were discussing. Yeah. So still, I do believe that we've covered actually a lot. I would like personally to thank you so much for a lot of inspirational concepts, and I definitely will use it. I would like to wish you the best of luck with the comic project. I hope that it will be possible then to see more of it. And definitely, if you will then share the link with me, then I will definitely make sure that the participants will receive it, so we can follow all of us this project and work with it. I would also like to thank to everyone for joining the discussion. And at this moment, I will just wish ALANA the good evening.
Thank you.
Good night. And
I'm going to bed now.
And to the rest of us, enjoy the break, and we will meet here at 2 p.m. for the workshop with Francesca Martinez Tagliavia on infrapolitics and the gender and performativity in political communication of nowadays. So thank you very much all, and
thanks everybody. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Enjoy yourselves. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.